Welcome, everybody, to this event where we're presenting 5 key economic priorities for the new government. My name is Stephen Millard. I'm the Deputy Director for Macroeconomic Modelling and Forecasting here at NISA, and I will be chairing this event. Ahead of hearing from our wonderful colleagues over there, I'm going to present some opening remarks. This general election is happening at a time when I think the UK government needs to grapple with some seriously big issues. And that's the next government, the one after that, the one after that, of whichever party. We have had 15 years of close to zero productivity growth. As a result, living standards have declined. People in the UK are worse off on average than they were, in fact, in 2019. At the same time, we've had Brexit, which is something I know that neither party really wants to speak about, but has contributed clearly to that decline in living standards. But moving forward, at the same time, we've also seen a decline in public services in this country. You just have to go to a typical NHS hospital and you will see the stress that the staff are under there. You will see signs that investment has not happened. I say that specifically because I was in a hospital on Sunday with my father-in-law, and it was not a nice place to be. At the same time as this has happened, we've seen a rising tax burden. We're paying more now as a percentage of GDP in tax than we have at any point since the early 1950s. All of these are big issues that the next government will need to grapple with. And on top of that, we've got the move to net zero. We need to get ourselves to a position where, if anything, we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere rather than putting it in. Now, the Conservative manifesto, which I've read, did talk about some of these issues. And I'm assuming the Labour manifesto, which is coming out literally as I speak, will also talk about some of those issues. But from what I've read so far, both parties seem to be tinkering at the edges. And the reason they're tinkering at the edges is because they're both committed to the fiscal rule that is currently in place. Now, Ben will talk more about this in a minute, but it strikes me that if we are going to solve any of these problems, we need government spending to rise, public investment in particular. And if that is going to happen to the degree that is necessary, then either taxes have to rise, or debt has to rise, or both. And I haven't yet seen either party really accept that fundamental truth. So today, we're going to present our work on what we think are the big issues, what we think the next government should be worrying about. And we'll also talk a little bit about some options around the tax increases that, as I said, were absolutely necessary. We're going to have some presentations on each of our 5 topic areas. The presentations are going to be very brief, so let me direct you to our website where you can find briefing documents on all of these issues and a couple more as special bonuses. To get there from the homepage, you click on the General Election 2024 button. After the brief presentations, we're going to hear the thoughts of Mark Franks and Ivor Crewe. Mark is an economist and director of the welfare program at the Nuffield Foundation, and possibly the most important person in the room, because without him, this work would not have been possible. Nuffield have very graciously funded the work that we've done on these general election briefings. So many, many thanks for that, Mark. Sir Ivor Crewe is the former Master of University College, Oxford. He's a former president of the Academy of Social Sciences and a former Vice Chancellor of the University of Essex, where he was also a professor in the Department of Government. After Mark and Ivor have spoken, then there will be plenty of time for questions. For those of you who are watching this event online, if you could put your questions into the chat, then I will read them out and direct them towards the most relevant person. Now, I think I've already spoken for way too long, so I'm going to hand over at this point to my colleague Ben Caswell, who's going to talk about the macroeconomic context.
So good morning, everyone. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the macroeconomic context and how it dovetails with our policy proposals for the fiscal framework. So as Stephen correctly pointed out in his opening remarks, the UK economy has not had the best performance of late. Now, often you see this graph with productivity and you see a break in the trend around 2008. I mean, that is true, but really we want to sort of set this in the context of how the UK economy performs by international standards. And up until 2008, the UK economy, in terms of productivity growth, on average was on par in the middle of the pack with OECD economies. It's now in the bottom two-thirds of productivity growth. So really, we've fallen behind the pack with comparable economies. Now, this obviously has important implications for GDP per head, which is now 1% below where it was in the last quarter of 2019. Now, this invariably puts pressure on public finances. If GDP per head is lower than where it was 5 years ago at the start of the last parliament, then naturally this makes a fiscal burden appear on the balance sheets of the government. So we think that this fiscal need is also being exacerbated by the increasing demands for government expenditure, right? So in terms of healthcare, social care, there are increasing demands because of demographic change. And also there is an increasing need to boost investment, public investment in infrastructure. So it's well sort of understood that there is a lot of connectivity issues in the UK economy. And we think that boosting infrastructure can help unlock a lot of that growth. So we really need the government to sort of be involved and be intervened. Now, in terms of what this means for policy proposals, as Stephen highlighted in his opening remarks, is one pillar which is going to be useful for part of basically unlocking this growth and revitalizing the UK economy. One of these policies is going to be fiscal framework reform, and that's going to play a supportive role in boosting GDP growth and fostering long-run robust growth. So we have a proposal which is based on three pillars, essentially. So the first one is that we discount public investment from the current deficit. So the day-to-day spending is separated out from the investment. So why is this the case? Well, because essentially the current rules state that at the end of a 5-year horizon, the debt to GDP has to be falling, right? But a lot of the benefits that we see from investment fall outside of this 5-year window. So essentially it appears as a cost with no benefit. Now, we know that public investment is very important for long-run growth, and we think that targeting the overall deficit is not helpful. It doesn't provide the right incentives, essentially. So the second point is going to be a fixed schedule for fiscal events. Now, of late, there's been a lot of uncertainty, and there's been a lot of policy churn. So we think that having a fixed schedule for fiscal events, in the same way that the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England has its meetings scheduled well in advance, will be helpful for fostering confidence and for providing a clear path forward for international markets and investors with regards to the UK's fiscal direction. So this is something that the Treasury could be empowered to do relatively easily. And I would think this would provide, welcome certainty and welcome sort of policy stability, given the experience of the last few years. So the third target would be to incorporate public sector net worth in some form. Now, this would take the form of essentially looking at what the government owes versus what it owes. So it's its balance sheets, assets versus liabilities. Now, if you set this as a target, you can essentially incentivize public investment by raising the asset side of this balance sheet. So given that UK public investment is relatively low for comparable OECD economies, it's, again, the bottom two-thirds, we think that incorporating public sector net worth could provide a useful incentive structure for raising public sector net worth. So these would be our policy proposals for the macroeconomic context, and I will hand over to Patricia, my next colleague. Sorry, Ed. Sorry, Ed will be next.
All right, thanks very much, Ben. So According to OBR data and NISA projections, the UK is not on track to meet its fiscal targets at the moment. And with their current spending plans, there's going to be a revenue gap of about £61 billion per year. And on top of that, government interest payments have jumped up post-pandemic from an average of about 8% of total government expenditure to 11%. So if the government does actually want to meet the current fiscal targets, and we say that we should think about changing those, but if they did want to meet these, we think they should raise tax rather than cut expenditure as that first piece of policy advice. So there are many unique challenges facing the UK economy today, and expenditure is vital, and now is not the time for cuts. So my colleagues will talk a little more about the challenges facing the economy, with climate change, low productivity, low living standards, and all these geopolitical risks. There is a need for government expenditure, and we can simulate the impact of the same consolidation using income tax rises or spending cuts to see what would be the difference. And although the short-term impact on GDP is kind of the same, we've got to think about the long-term impact, and you can see there is a stark difference when the government cuts back on investment. It starts to have real long-run impacts on GDP growth. Second point is to raise income taxes rather than other taxes. Parties seem to have ruled out general rises in VAT and corporation tax, which we think is a good thing. But they shouldn't rule out income tax rises as well. So we feel these are the least distortionary for GDP growth. Again, we do a similar simulation where we say if the government wants to raise the same amount of revenue through these three different tax options, what will be the impact? And we can see quite clearly that income tax is the least distortionary on GDP. So that's where government should be focusing, and they should absolutely not be ruling it out as a potential. Finally, we at NISA have said for some time that parties should explore a land value tax. So this is a tax option that reduces distortion and encourages investment on land. So this is definitely something that parties should explore and really consider. So our overall kind of messages when it comes to the tax side is raise taxes, don't cut expenditure, focus on income taxes rather than any other taxes, and explore this land value tax. And now I'll pass over to Patricia.
Thanks very much, Ed. Well, climate change is not anymore an environmental issue on the sidelines. Climate change is a social and economic issue that the next government should take into account in their manifestos and in their program. And we have seen before, the delay in the actions and the clear strategies has taken us to some concerns of reaching the next carbon budgets, and that will have catastrophic effects, not just in the economy, but also in the social environment in this economy. So what we have researched and what we think that the next government should take into account is, first of all, accelerate the efforts in some of the key emitter sectors, like the buildings and the transport sector that are the highest emitters. Just as an example, most of the houses that we are going to live by 2050 are already built. So we need to make them more efficient. Second bit that the next government should take into account is to establish a carbon pricing mechanism that is fair and is clear. As there are some research that show that the carbon pricing that is now in the UK is not being enough to incentivize the decarbonization of the economy. So for the next government, they should impose higher penalties and expand the sectoral inclusion of that carbon pricing mechanism. We have used our model 19 and the NGFS scenarios to compare the different revenue options, because the carbon tax also gives revenue to the government, and how they use that revenue will also affect the mitigation of the climate impact, and also can be implemented to further climate action. And what we have found out is that a full recycling option towards public investment has the greatest benefits to the GDP. The two last points that we think that the next government should take into account, first of all, is to boost the public investment, but also mobilize the private investment. Public investment won't be enough, so the government has to have clear strategies to mobilize this private investment towards low carbon technologies and innovation. And finally, not just the funding, but also the green skills that are going to be needed in the future. The government has to develop plans how they're going to support and create these green skills that the workforce needs for the future.
Good morning, everyone. I'll briefly talk about the productivity problem in the UK and outline some of the suggestions to address this issue. So productivity is the cornerstone of economic growth and improved living standards. So the more productive we are, the better off we'll be. However, since the financial crisis, the UK has faced a concerning decline in productivity growth, performing worse than peers like Germany and the US. The poor performance is largely attributed to the underachievement of regions outside London and the metropolitan areas of the Southeast, creating significant regional inequalities and dragging down the overall economy. Addressing this challenge of boosting productivity and leveling out between low and high productive regions is one of the UK biggest challenges. So several factors contribute to the UK poor productivity, including inadequate policymaking, insufficient investments, and skills mismatches. Policymaking has been characterized by short-termism, resulting in policy churn in weak institutions. Over-centralization is another obstacle to productivity-enhancing policies. Additionally, the UK has seen a decline in government and business investments, coupled with a pattern of prioritizing consumption over long-term investments. This underinvestment has also restricted provision of training and skills development. Although the share of highly educated people in the total workforce is rising, both public and private sectors are trapped in a vicious cycle of low skills, low wages, and low productivity. So to tackle this challenge, we propose 3 recommendations. The first, reform institutions and policymaking. So the government needs to commit and integrate productivity strategy for the long term to provide direction and stability across the government. Also create a statutory body in charge of productivity and industry strategy to coordinate policies and reduce the persistent problem of short-termism and over-centralization. Also improve coordination between central, devolved, and local governments. And perhaps maybe establish a national development bank to provide public investment at scale. Second, boosting investment. In a nutshell, we know that the government needs to develop a credible long-term plan to address the shortfall in public investment and also unlock greater business investment, as my colleague said before. And finally, addressing skills mismatches. So provide technical training and target upskilling programs for adults, particularly in sectors vulnerable to automation, and also develop the green skills that Patricia just mentioned. Also strengthen apprenticeship schemes, enhance vocational pathways, and promote employee development. Build a skilled and adaptive workforce through a culture of lifelong learning. By implementing these measures, the UK can achieve sustainable and inclusive economic growth, bridging the regional disparities and unlocking the nation's full productivity potential. However, to achieve these goals, it requires a sustained long-term commitment that goes beyond the electoral cycles. The future government must prioritize growth as a central pillar of its economic agenda. Thank you.
So over the last 5 years, we've seen significant income and price shocks. So just for reference, we characterize living standards by equivalized household real disposable income, which is personal income adjusted for household competition, composition, inflation, and housing costs. So before I go into price shocks, looking at income shocks, which you can see more in our living standards brief on our website, the lowest earners experience a shortfall of around £4,600 in 2024 to 25 compared to December 2019, which is uprooted by inflation. So this is comparison between these 2 years. So this is the income has been cushioned by universal credit uplifts, the rise in national living wage and minimum wage, and changes in rates and taxes. However, when we look at the cost of living crisis, which we can see on this slide, so this is affected on average houses around 6,600. This is relative to prices in 2019, is a cumulation of over the last 5 years. So we see this is around, due to solely the cost of living crisis, this is around 3,700 for the bottom income decile. And more significantly, for the squeezed middle, it's around 8,800 just for the cost of living. So the amount of prices have risen. It's around 8,800. So this really highlights the squeezed middle, and when we add the effect of rent and high mortgage interest rates, you can see as a proportion of their disposable income, the squeezed middle come out the worst. So our policy recommendations is to continue to increase the national living wage and national minimum wage above CPI, increase the personal allowance rather than cut national insurance rates. So increasing the lower bound rate, which is 12,570. This will have a much more less regressive effect than cutting national insurance rates. A favorable energy price gap, because lower income households use less energy, and by increasing the per unit of energy by usage will help lower income households and also reduce energy usage. We recommend more targeted support rather than universal support like energy price guarantee, as this is more cost efficient. As you can see earlier, the energy price guarantee was skewed towards the upper income deciles. And then, as Ben spoke about, significant public investment, around 4% is needed to promote growth in productivity to increase wages over the long term. And this would also provide quality service, which also have an impact on the price shocks by pushing people more to pay for services such as dental, with this will hit people's incomes more. So I'll pass on.
Thanks, everyone. As I said, that was our briefings in a nutshell, but please do go to our website where you can find the whole articles themselves. Well worth the read, and I'm not just saying that because their needs are output. Anyway, at this point, I'd like to call on Mark Franks to discuss what we've just seen. Mark,
would you like me to stand up there, or
if you could, yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you to all of the presenters. I think you did a fantastic job in summarising a huge amount of material in such a short amount of time, and I would recommend the full reports to people who want to learn more, because there's a lot more detail in there. Just to introduce myself, I'm Mark Franks. I'm the Director of Welfare at the Nuffield Foundation, and we're an independent funder across the domains of education, justice and welfare that aims to support research which changes people's lives. And the work that we're seeing today specifically is funded through our General Election Analysis and Briefing Fund, which we set up last year, nice and early, just in case a surprise election was called, which proved to be a good call. But the purpose of that was threefold. First of all, it was to improve the development of evidence in order to improve the quality of policy pledges and policy development. The second was to improve the accuracy of public claims through providing independent scrutiny and assessment of them. And the third was to provide information to support the debate, including in the media, but ultimately to people making better informed voting decisions. And this is exactly the sort of material that we're seeing today that I think meets those aims very well. In terms of my reflections, which I'll keep relatively brief, I wanted to just focus on a few issues which perhaps they're things that are coming through this research, but also other research that we've supported, where sometimes I feel it's not getting quite the profile and the attention it deserves in the election debate. And it was fantastic actually to see that a lot of the themes that I'm going to be briefly talking about were actually covered in the previous presentations. So I want to organise that into three buckets. So the first is just to talk a little about tax and spending. The second is growth and productivity, and the third is living standards and quality of life. So on tax and spending, I think one thing that isn't discussed enough and was discussed here is the potential benefits of reforming the tax system. So the political debate is very much about pledges not to increase tax or not to increase particular types of tax. I don't think it focuses enough on the fact that our tax system is not as efficient as it could be. And we all know about the various cliff edges that exist and the incentives, and the fact that some taxes are more economically distortionary than others. And obviously, when you commit to, for example, not raising income tax for anybody, as I think both parties have, both of the main parties, then you reduce your ability to reform the system. And I think in a situation where economic growth is struggling in the context of people already having a high tax burden, public services under pressure and high national debt, what you want to be doing is raising that tax in as a least distortionary way as possible, so that the economy can be supported through that. And so I think taking decisions now or making pledges now which make that much harder is obviously disadvantageous to that. The second thing I would say, and this is motivated by work that Nuffield has funded previously, including by NISA, but we funded a body of work around decision-making processes and how that works within government. And I think it's easy to overlook that we spend a vast amount of money on public services in this country, and you could if you just took that money and thought, can we actually spend that slightly better, even if only slightly better, through having better policy development and implementation processes, there's actually huge gains that could come from that, because the amounts of money that you're starting with are so large. So if the Treasury functioned better, if there was the right institutional structure in place to support those types of decisions, which again was covered in the presentations, then I think there's huge gains that can be made there. And so both of these points really are that you can focus on the level of tax and the level of spending, but how you tax and how you spend is really important in itself. So that was my first set of points. The second is on growth and productivity. Something I'm very worried about, and perhaps hasn't featured enough in the election debate as I've seen it, is labour market participation. So for decades, we've had poor productivity growth. The economy has grown largely through more people entering the labour market and through growth in population. And neither of those things can be expected to continue indefinitely. And I think what we're seeing in terms of potential long-term trends in the labour market are quite worrying. So we know that the pandemic led to a large number of people, particularly in their 50s and above, exiting the labour market, and not all of whom have re-entered. And so that is effectively a loss to the UK's productive capacity. We're also seeing increasing rates of people not working in their 20s due to ill health, and particularly mental ill health. And that is a critical period for anybody's life, where they develop human capital, they learn how to operate in the workplace, they develop skills that will stay with them for the rest of their life. And I think it is an extreme concern that we're seeing that growing trend among our younger population as they enter the workforce. And so effectively what you might have, the worst case scenario, is a workforce that's been squeezed from both sides, which ultimately will affect our ability to grow the economy. So and also, of course, as the cost to the state through increases to employment support allowance and incapacity benefit. And so I think that's something that really needs to be thought about and should be a top priority for whoever forms the next government. The other thing I wanted to mention, again, a lot of colleagues talked about investment, and clearly investment is very important. We have no investment in this country. We should be investing more, and I think that relates to both public service, public investment, and also business investment. I wanted to talk about one specific aspect of that, which is research and development. So the current government had a target to increase our spending on R&D to the OECD average, which would be progress, but of course the average is just that. Some countries are doing a lot more, and there is scope to be much more ambitious in this respect. And we know there's plenty of evidence to suggest that that type of investment yields very high economic returns. It does that directly through the benefits of the investment itself, and also there's a very strong correlation between public sector investment in R&D and private sector investment if you look across countries. So you could expect that the public sector investment went up, businesses will be investing more as well. So I think that's something that perhaps hasn't featured prominently enough in the debate. I mean, of course, there's other calls for investment as well, but I think that's one area that should be focused on. And in terms of net zero, it's a pretty obvious win-win. It helps us to meet could help us to meet our net zero obligations. It could also it will create jobs, and it will actually, potentially boost productivity. So thinking about that as a key priority for the government is something that I think there is plenty of evidence to support. The third area I just wanted to talk about a little was living standards and quality of life, and what we're seeing in terms of the decline in people's disposable income and household incomes is extremely concerning, particularly for those towards the bottom of the income distribution who are least able to cope with that. I did want to make a point, and I'm afraid I plagiarised this point from an event earlier this week, but I think it's a really important one. About public service and public services and the importance of those for people's standards of living. So we know if you're a lower quartile household, the amount of your consumption of public services will be significantly higher than the amount of consumption that you fund directly yourself. And if we're thinking about the quality of people's lives, then that is a huge part of it that we're not really measuring very well. To the extent we're measuring it, there's a lot of signs of strains in public services, and other Nuffield projects have focused on that. But nevertheless, we don't have a systematic way of looking at that in the way that we look at income. And actually, it's by bringing the two together that we get a better understanding of what's really happening in people's quality of life. And there's a couple of other aspects of quality of life I wanted to mention in closing, drawing on other Nuffield work. The first is housing, which actually has featured quite a lot in the debate around this election, and I think rightfully so. I think insecure and poor quality housing and affordable housing is a huge strain for people and needs to be a priority. And again, in terms of net zero, if we can improve our housing stock, it can actually help us with that as well. So I think that's rightly been more prominent. It's felt more prominent in this election campaign to me than it has in previous ones, and I think that's right. And the final thing I want to mention, just relating to another Nuffield interest and one of my own, is the changing nature of work and technology. So one of the big projects we support is the PISA-ED's review of work and well-being, and that's looking at how changes in technology are affecting people's well-being. Of course, changes in technology in the workplace also affect productivity, and so they're very important as part of that debate. But what we're also seeing, what seems to be emerging from that work, and it's still ongoing, is a sense that for certain individuals, generally higher earning individuals, productivity, technology and productivity growth through technology are positive things for that segment of the workforce. Where it can be more problematic both to people's health and their wider well-being is for people towards the bottom of the income distribution, perhaps people in more insecure work. And so there's a risk that as we rightly would look at technology to boost productivity growth, which we desperately need, that also drives increasing inequalities. And I think that's something that we should all be thinking about. So those are my reflections. Very happy to offer more as we go on, but thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Mark, thank you ever so much. Very useful food for thought, I think, in many respects. I'm now going to call upon Ivor Crew to offer some of his. Yeah.
Excuse me whilst I handle this little bit of technology. Thank you. Well, if I could introduce myself, I'm Ivor Crew, and I was introduced as someone who has been involved in the senior management of various academic institutions and bodies. But there was a time when I was a Carbonell Garden backbench academic studying politics, particularly elections and parties and policy making in this country, and that is going to shape some of the brief comments that I make in the next 10 minutes. But first of all, can I just say that I found the briefings that we've heard today extraordinarily useful and valuable, both in the information that they provided and in the well thought through and constructive recommendations that they made. I hope they're read by the politicians and taken notice of. But I will say something about the obstacles to their doing so in a moment. The figures that stand out for me and that I think remain in my kind of memory are the anemic average annual growth in productivity since 2008, since the global financial crisis, 0.4% on average. The very low levels both of private and public investment in the UK. We're languishing at the bottom of towards the bottom of the OECD tables for comparable economies. Something that's barely been mentioned, although it's prominent in the briefings, which are the stagnant real wages since 2008, and the, I think, historically unprecedented decline since 2019, 7% decline in household real disposable income, which translates into a £14,000 cumulative hit to the average household finances over 5 years, with just some mitigation for those in the lowest deciles. And the fact that almost half of the income distribution, certainly the lowest 4 deciles, a little bit more than that, are not going to return to pre-pandemic levels until 2028. So it's all of this, of course, alongside the crumbling of public services that is going to produce a Labour government on July the 4th. I regard myself as a psophologist and therefore the right to confidently predict this, and quite possibly with a 3-digit majority, and the majority matters. There is a historical pattern here. It's in fact quite rare for the Labour Party to win emphatic majorities in this country. They've only done so 3 times in the past 80 years. But when it does, as in 1945 under Attlee, 1966 or 1964 and 66 under Wilson, and 1997 under Blair, it's after long periods of Conservative government, which limply ends in a palpable sense of national decline or emergency. And it's, in each case, voters put Labour into power on a promise of national renewal in the form of economic recovery and social reconstruction. And the Labour Party is promising the same again, and these briefings sketch out a strategy with some specific policy recommendations for economic renewal, which is, of course, both a condition for the repair of our social fabric, but also reliant on the improvement in our social infrastructure. And in fact, this chicken and egg problem of what comes first, given that both depend upon each other, I think is a real challenge for any government. And with great respect to the briefings, and this is not a criticism, I don't think has really been worked out as to quite how you bring them together. So of the recommendations that have been made, again, the ones that stand out for me are the reform of the fiscal framework and the abandonment of medium-term 5-year deficit and debt targets in favour of long-term fiscal sustainability and investment, and more realistic valuations of the social benefits of long-term investment, whether it's transport infrastructure or childcare or skills training or public health. There was a nice piece by Jonathan Portes in yesterday's Guardian about how Sure Start under the Blair Labour government had been was eventually dropped because it was thought to be an investment that didn't really pay for itself. But there's now a lot of evidence that, in fact, in addition to the social benefits, there were some economic benefits as well. Increasing public investment to 4% of GDP, both with direct benefits and incentives for private investment. And an industrial strategy, in other words, an explicit prioritization of some sectors for public investment, clean energy, biomedical engineering, and so forth. And then finally, fiscal balance achieved by raising income tax and preference corporation tax. I was surprised that raising and reforming VAT was not regarded as a viable alternative source of public revenues. And I'd be quite interested if this could be explained. And then finally, short-term targeted increases in welfare support to meet the increasing poverty in the lowest deciles. I really just want to make 2 points about all of that. The first is that the incoming government's inheritance is far worse than it was in 1997 and far worse than it was in the mid-1960s. And therefore, the scale and the complexity of the challenges that the new government will face are of a wholly different order of magnitude. You have to go back to 1945, I think, to find something comparable. But there were some conditions in the situation of 1945, in particular, public trust and political support for the measures that had to be taken, which are, I think, absent at the moment. And given the challenge, the incoming government will need a strategy, I think, for the reform of governance, for the reform of policy implementation, and as well as plans for political mobilization. And I'm not sure that they are there at all and have been thought about. In other words, the UK approaches 2020 in, I think, an unusually weak position as a result of, well, some self-inflicted causes, the deficit reduction strategy of 2010 to 15 and Brexit, and overlaid by the external shocks of COVID and the energy crisis following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have public services that are grossly underfunded while tax share has risen sharply. That tax share will continue to rise until 2020, until 2028. It's already baked in to public expenditure plans. And of course, there is the steady upward pressure on social provision that arises from demographic changes, in particular, an aging society, and this was mentioned, more investment is needed to make up lost ground in the net zero target and to replace carbon-related income streams, which are going to decline. The difference between now and before is that in 1964, 1997, the country was not stuck in a long rut of economic stagnation. There was steady growth in real wages, and actually quite substantial growth in real wages in the decades before 2008. There was steady growth, some catch up in productivity in the 1980s, 1990s. Tax revenues were rising prior to 1997, which gave New Labour room for increased public spending, even though that was delayed in the first government. And the debt to GDP ratio was below 40% in 1997. And today, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 100% or something close to that. It's not all gloom. There will probably be a lowering of interest rates as inflation comes under control. So there will be some wiggle room, and probably the worst of the aftershocks of Brexit and Ukraine are now diminishing. But nonetheless, the challenge is of a different order from 1964, 1997, as I have said. Now, let us assume that the incoming government adopts the recommendations of NISA, together with other policies that it has floated, such as loosening planning restrictions. Starmer frequently talks of leading a mission-led government, which he obviously believes is a different kind of government from the governments I always thought we had before. I always thought they had missions before, but he clearly believes that it is possible to have a government that is more focused on a small number of priorities. And we know what those priorities are in his mind. They are wealth creation, that is what he's saying right now in the launch of the Labour Manifesto, growth, increased productivity. And he said before, this is going to be at the center of everything it does. It's not really unlike what Liz Truss said when she became Prime Minister, even though she messed it up. There is an implicit assumption there that a comfortable majority at Westminster, combined with sheer political will, is sufficient. In other words, the incoming government will have, assuming it has a comfortable majority, at least 4 to 5 years to make the changes. And if it has a 3-digit majority, then there's a reasonable expectation of 10 years of it being re-elected. That gives it, at the very start of its period of office, 2 to 3 years of political capital to spend on decisions that are immediately unpopular, but have a long-term payoff. But that itself is insufficient. What a government also needs, certainly a mission-led government with growth and wealth creation at the center of its ambitions, is a capacity for strategic oversight, policy formation and implementation, and the political mobilization to drive these recommendations through. I just want to overstay my welcome by a few minutes and say 1 or 2 things very briefly about what that might involve. Strategic capacity at the heart of government needs to be rebuilt. Currently, what we regard as the core central executive in this country, namely number 10 and the Cabinet Office, are weak institutions. They do not have the executive monitoring or brigading powers needed to drive through major structural reforms. Take the Treasury, for example. The Treasury killed levelling up. There was a well thought out white paper for levelling up, written by or conducted by Michael Gove, involving considerable structural reform and public investment it was killed. Should the Treasury retain its current functions and structure? And if it does, will it be possible for a growth-led government to achieve its objectives? Or should it be split into a finance department and a beefed-up department for infrastructure, business, and innovation? Does the senior civil service have the necessary expertise and administrative skills and capacity? If some responsibility for investment and growth is to be delegated to the city regions, and there are pros and cons, I think, of doing that, but if it is, do the city regions have the administrative capacity and expertise to undertake these tasks? And should indeed responsibility for growth-led public investment be delegated to the city regions if they are going to be given enhanced powers to tax and borrow, which is what they would need, which immediately establishes them as political competitors with the government. A little word about politics. Public morale is exceptionally low. Trust in political solutions to the country's afflictions has declined very sharply. Labour's majority will be built on a little over 40% of the vote on a turnout of between 60 and 65%. That is no more than 25% of the electorate. That is the degree of positive public support that they have. Party loyalty, which is the necessary basis for giving governments a period of grace to implement change and painful reforms and benefit of the doubt, has diminished. Voters are fickle and impatient. The record-breaking swing that probably will overturn a Conservative majority of 80 into a Labour majority of possibly 100 or more could very easily be repeated in reverse in 5 years' time, and governments know this, and therefore under immense electoral and political pressure to engage in short-termism rather than long-termism. So how does a government that wishes to be radical, how does it mobilize sustained public support over that period? From where will a stable coalition of support come? It was available to the Attlee government of 1945. It was available to the Wilson government of 64-66, when society was divided into loyal phalanxes of Conservative and Labour supporters based on class institutions. That is not the case. That is not the case now. Does the government have a strategy for mobilizing a coalition of support? I'm not convinced it does. And then finally, there are decisions, what you might call decisions of statecraft, that a government will have to make. And it's not clear to me that this has been thought about very much so far. For example, how can any government make progress on meeting very urgent social needs, NHS waiting lists, teacher recruitment, you name it, while laying the foundations for long-term institutional economic reforms in a very cramped fiscal space? What comes first? Should the government prosecute its agenda early and very hard in the 2 to 3 years of political time that it has, therefore making rush decisions? Or should it prioritize a few early easy wins while deferring hard decisions, which then may not be taken at all because of electoral pressures? Or should it play it long and cautious, as Thatcher did, but she was lucky she had the Falklands War and some economic recovery in '83. Had she not had that, she wouldn't have been re-elected and the government would have gone down as a failure. In other words, the government has got to move at great pace while crafting a message of patience. Does this country have in any of the parties the political leadership that is capable of doing that, but which is necessary if the recommendations made in these briefings are to be undertaken.
Thank you very much. Even more food for thought there. We're now going to move to a Q&A session. I'm kind of hoping that I can work out how to look at questions on this thing. We need some help with that. Okay, so I'm going to go straight to questions from our online people. Question for any of the panelists that may find it relevant. A lot of politicians talk about growth as being panacea to pay for the good public services we want, but in many cases, the cost of public service will increase if there is growth. For instance, the growth is reflected in growing real wages. In the private sector, at first, this will increase the cost of state pensions, not just under the political promise of the triple lock, but under the underlying legislative requirements of earnings lined up ratings. And if private sector pay starts rising again, public sector pay will ultimately need to follow, otherwise services will fail due to staff shortages. Growth that mainly comes from increasing the labour force, for instance by immigration, rather than increasing per capita earnings, could address this. But I suspect that this isn't the kind of growth that most people really want. Any thoughts on that? This seems like a macro question there.
Yeah, okay, I have a few thoughts on that. So the growth question is a good one for public finances. So there is that third option that you just get really lucky with the economy. And by some coincidence of factors coming together, you pull off a growth rate of 1.5% per year. I think that's unlikely looking at the fundamentals, right? But there's two types of growth really, right? So you can have increases in productivity, increases in the supply side, increase in the long run potential of the economy. And that doesn't necessarily have to be inflationary. If you have a bunch of demand side pressures and you essentially say, okay, wages rise, this increases the cost of services. And yeah, in that case, the growth is not really that constructive and you won't get any real increase in output. But if it's driven by the supply side, if it's driven by investment, so I mean, business investment in the UK right now is pretty low by international comparable standards. So since the turn of the century, it's been about 9%. That puts us right down the bottom. I think we're just above Greece and OECD, so that's about 19th in the OECD, so well below average. Now, if you can actually raise business investment alongside raising public investment, and you can increase the long-run capacity of the economy, you can get increases in output that don't lead to this sort of inflationary pressure. So you simply produce more with the existing factors of production that you have. In that case, it doesn't have to be inflationary and you can get these increases. So that would be my sort of point on that, given that healthcare is a pressing need as well.
Robin.
I think just to carry on with what Mark Frank says about who uses the services and also whose wages are rising. So if you've got an aggregate like number, this is not spread out across the whole distribution. And it's also who's the working in the NHS, how much are they wages going for? And it's also a sense of efficiency, like how you use the resources. So yes, wages would go up, the cost of wages would go up to the institutes, but it's also if the money was used in a more efficient manner, focusing, for example, NHS, focusing on primary care, rather than doing for MRI scans and stuff like that. That could be an answer as well. It's not all wages. There's not as clear like link, and I think that is important too.
Thanks, Robin. I should have mentioned up front that was Martin Lunnan who asked the question. So thanks, Martin, for sending a question in. Please do keep sending questions in. We've got plenty of time for our Q&A, and it'd be good to have lots of questions for the panel. And M. Davies has asked the question: what is the single most important thing the new government should do to attract foreign investment? Who wants to take that one on? It's not Ed Davies. No. Of course.
I mean, I think it kind of ties up all of our points together in terms of having a long-term, clear, credible strategic plan for the government, which relates to Ben and the kind of fiscal targets, but it also relates to minimizing risks to the economy, which relates to Patricia and climate change, thinking through avoiding those risks. Because businesses will react to that, and if they know that there is a clear, credible, certain path of the economy, they're much more likely to invest than if they're not really sure what's going on. So maybe the government says we're going to meet targets, but if it doesn't do so in a strategic, holistic way, that won't drive in business investment as much.
Hang on, can we get them microphones?
I'll add a little bit. So
And then we'll go to Abinay.
Yeah. I think on attracting international investment, having a clear path forward, like you said, with credible announcements, and basically showing your workings. And one of the reasons why the bond markets turned liquid in 2022 with the mini budget is because essentially the Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng circumvented the OBR, right? So if you make proposals for increased public investment, but they're sound and proportionate, and you can explain to the market how you get there, then there's not an issue of suddenly markets being spooked and borrowing costs spiraling out of control. So it's really just about that kind of communication. And part of the fiscal framework reform is to have these scheduled events, right? So these scheduled events that are going to be in the diary are going to create this certainty. And this certainty is going to essentially foster confidence and business sentiments among international investors. So if you provide this clear path forward, I think there's no reason why the UK is not an attractive place to invest. And really, it's just about having those fixed dates in the diary that uncouples the sort of political cycles from the economic cycles. And it basically insulates fiscal announcements from political maneuvering, essentially. So, yeah, that would be my addition to that.
Okay, if we can get the microphone to Abinay. Abinay, I know you're loud, so we can all hear you, but it's for people online.
Thanks, Abinay Mutu, Nisa. Just wanted to say that we all recognize that investment is what's key to get UK PLC moving. And there's no money inside the country, basically. And so this question is great. We need to get money from outside the country. Foreign investment could be the way to do it, to at least kickstart. And one of them, and if you look at economies like China, a lot of their growth last 20 years is driven a lot by foreign investment. India is not going to grow fast enough because not enough foreign investment. So this is a great question. So how does UK, so given that context, how does UK PLC attract foreign investment? If someone to come just like that, by the way, it would have been there by now. There's competition for foreign investment across the world, from Africa, from Europe. So we need to do some policy and make it attractive. We have a strong rule of law in this country, which is unparalleled across much of the world. So that's going. What's missing is things like tax breaks. So this was an idea floated, I think, Boris Johnson or before him about, after Brexit, let's make, as semi-joke, let's make this place Singapore on Thames. We don't have to go that far, but I don't see any kind of tax incentives to compete with Europe and the BRICS countries to bring that investment. So I think I would say that this government should be thinking about providing incentives for foreign investment. It could be a tax break for the next 5 years. Leave the details aside, but that would be a great way to bring more money into this country. Thanks.
I mean, I was about to go to you, Ivor, actually. I was going to say, I mean, something I've heard a lot is that Brexit was a big change, not because of Brexit per se, but because it was an illustration of a deeper concern about the way the policy is made in the UK and the quality of our politicians. So I was going to ask Ivor to comment on that, but you had a comment anyway.
I'm not an economist, so I can't give an answer based on macroeconomic consideration. But I do think that political stability is important, and that has been referenced in some of the briefings. Fixed dates for budgets, and not too many budgets. An annual budget, a clear medium to long-term strategic plan, but some other things. A fixed date for elections, for example. The uncertainty of when an election will be held is a form of planning blight when it comes to investment. In addition to relatively united parties that do not ditch their leaders every 2 or 3 years.
Thanks, David. It's comment and a question from Peter Dalton. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Dan Micklin, RSA. I'm just interested, there don't seem to be many projections of how your policies would actually improve the economy. I mean, maybe you've done this elaborated elsewhere, but it's not like an IFS presentation in that sense. But I agree a lot with Ivor, actually. It's a perfect storm. Many things are coming together at the wrong time, as ever happens. And very much, it's a chicken and egg, like the analogy, you know, the structural change and the economic change, structural change in government. It's a big problem, really, is Labour, although they're not directly spelling it out in their platform at the moment, but I think a lot of work's going on in the background to devolve spending, as Ivor mentioned, to the regions. And we're not even ready in the regions to do that. We haven't got the institutional structure in place. We only have 13 mayors at the moment. I mean, it's got to go across the country. We need a better devolved, House of Lords reform, all sort of things to a federal structure more. Unfortunately, as he also mentioned, public is very impatient. they want quick wins, and unfortunately, we're not in a post-war situation or post-90s where people are more amenable to things. We've got perfect storms with migration. And although you mentioned, I like the idea of investment, foreign investment, but also in war situation with Russia. And we're talking about, blocking Chinese investment, the very thing that could actually help us all. In other words, climate change, war, I think that's, in a sense, a phone ideology is developed in Britain. The warmongers are out there in the throes. Sorry, probably gone on for too long. Just
yes, I mean, interesting thoughts there. I mean, the bottom line, I guess, to paraphrase, is you can't do the economics, you can't do the leveling up, you can't do the things that we're asking until you've got the institutional structures in place. And it's very hard to get the institutional structures in place without spending money. So it's, I think I summed it up perfectly, actually, in his remarks. I couldn't do any better than that. It kind of brings me to Peter Dalton's question, which I was about to ask. He says there, I totally agree with Professor Ivor Crew's observations on the lack of expertise at the heart of government. We've seen the retirement of a highly skilled set of civil servants, particularly economists. How do we replace them in the short run to solve the immediate crisis so clearly outlined? How can we grow back the expertise we need? Do you not think we need a combined National Economic Research Centre, which combines the skills of IFS, CEP, NISA, and the OBR to proactively address the nation's problems? Ivor, I don't know if you want to add on the how we can improve the skills within government, and then maybe I'll take the economics one.
That is a very big question. I think that there are skills gaps and expertise gaps in the civil service, and they have not been good at outsourcing. They are not particularly good at negotiating mega contracts with the private sector. But it is an institution still that I think has the capacity to upgrade its skills and learn very quickly. And it still attracts and recruits people of very high quality and great ability. I don't think we should underestimate the potential of the civil service to serve the country. there are some reforms in the civil service that are long overdue, of which I think the most important is to change the career structures within the civil service so that a fulfilling and well-paid career within the civil service is available without switching posts from one department to another when ministers are doing the same. This seems to me the greatest structural weakness of the civil service. The civil servants won't agree with that, I can tell you now, because they regard the opportunity to go from one position to another position very often in a different department as part of the attraction of being in the civil service. But it is a kind of restricted practice, really. And I would like to see a civil service in which careers are developed within, if not one, at least a cluster of departments, so that experience and expertise can be accumulated over time.
For what it's worth, I completely agree with that. It's we at NISA have criticized policy churn a lot, but churn within the civil service. I mean, I noticed it very much at the Bank of England, where the model was the same. You did two years in a particular role, 2 years in another role, 2 years in another role. You got a very good, well-rounded view of central banking, but the civil service kind of had a problem in terms of the number of people with those sort of really high technical skills that they needed. I mean, the bank was, I have to say, solved it now, I think. But maybe there's scope for the civil service to move in the direction that Ivor said, of actually having careers that develop your skills a little bit more narrowly than in the past. Coming back to Peter's idea of a national economic research centre, this has to be properly funded, of course, not a series of small-scale competing institutions like those in other countries. So, I mean, one organization we've done quite a bit of work with over the years is the CPB in the Netherlands, who, to a large degree, are actually Peter's thing. They fully funded by the government. They do microeconomics, they do macroeconomics. They look at things that are of particular interest to the policymakers of the day, but they also do more sort of fundamental research as well. So setting up that kind of organization would be good. Whether you could persuade the IFS, CEP, us, and the OBR to all work together, that's a more interesting thing. Of course, I would suggest that everything should be brought under the auspices of NISA, as the UK's oldest independent research institution, but I suspect that'd be a hard sell with some of those other organizations. But the idea of the government better funding economics is something I think all of those organizations would agree on. Okay, I'm going to go back to this is really a comment from Glenn Bramley, actually two comments on tax priorities. One is increase income tax more on the retirement age population. They have been overprivileged hitherto and are less relevant to the issue of work incentives. Well, the retired population actually pay income tax at the same rate with the same allowances as everybody else. So I'm not entirely sure you would necessarily want to increase that. What you might not want to do, at risk of commenting on a particular policy recommendation, but what you might not want to do is to treat retired as a different population for the purposes of income tax. That policy has been mooted in the manifestos. It really, for my liking, doesn't make sense. But I think there's a lot of retirees do pay tax. Let's not forget that. Land value tax, we already have a mechanism here which can be applied much more effectively. I'm not sure we do have a land value tax as such. The comment from Glenn suggests that planning obligations effectively do what a land value tax would do. Well, I mean, the planning obligations, I guess, are a way of ensuring that you get the particular building you want in the particular areas you want them. But, anybody who I've ever spoken to about the housing market would tell me that the result of planning regulations is we don't get housing at all. So I'm not sure that's the answer. Whereas taxing the value of land, you know, and which encourages the owners of land to put the land to its best uses, I think would seem a much better policy. And of course, unlike a lot of taxes, which you can avoid potentially by shipping off to the Cayman Islands, it's very hard to do that with land. Very hard to sort of dig it up, transport it to the Caymans and say it's them. We've actually run out of questions online, which is why I've been rambling, but we have a question at the back of the room.
Thank you, Ian Balding. I have a question concerning the political call around Rachel Reeves, because all you're saying does depend to a degree on her capacity and the people closest to her to make a difference. And I'm an investment banker by trade. I've been engaged in politics for 50 years. And you can see how individuals and a group of individuals make a difference. I had the privilege to meet Adam Ridley, who was Margaret Thatcher's great economic guru in the middle 80s, and had dealings with him over several years because I was living in France and the French were interested in benefiting from the experience of the British Big Bang to do the same thing in France. But so who are the individuals? And I think I'm only asking for that which is public knowledge, but certainly I haven't followed this, around Rachel Reeves, the 2, 3, 4, who will help her determine the policies to put into action if the inevitable or seemingly inevitable happens. And then the link between that and of course Starmer and Rayner and the capacity that Rachel Reeves will have to push forward with that leadership team what she thinks and her economic team think is necessary. Does that make sense of the question?
It does. I'm going to throw it to Ivor in a minute, but I'm just going to make the obvious comment, which is whoever wins the election, I think the first people the Chancellor, whoever they are, should come and talk to is obviously Nisa. You know, we have the policies that that they need to put into place. So well, that's the purpose of this lunch. That's exactly right. Ivor, I don't know if you're on top of the Rachel Reeves's team anymore. I certainly am not. I have to say.
I'm very sorry. I really can't enlighten. To identify now, I have to tell well, we're obviously criticizing all the way I double checked and I very echoed. People were thinking of how to reform the trade and cooperation agreement and what sort of implementation is carried out with that. So we knew that. Surely there must be reasonable knowledge and clue around where it really will that something you rapidly discuss.
There probably is, and it will be well worth us finding out, as you say. I'm going to turn this into a question, though, again for Ivor, which is, to what extent is the ability of the government to push through and make good policy of any description, but economic in particular, dependent upon the advisors around the Chancellor? And is that the sort of the target audience, really, in terms of Nisa output?
I'll try and answer both questions if I can. Although I may not be able to very satisfactorily, I genuinely do not know who Rachel Reeves listens to, or even who is allowed, so to speak, access to her. What might be called Team Starmer, which includes Rachel Reeves, of course, is a small group, quite secretive,
and have not been, I think, at least in public, as open to advice from, a wide range of specialists, as has been true of some incoming parties of government in the past. We knew who was advising Margaret Thatcher before she took office. We are much, generally, I think we're much less well informed in the case of Starmer. I don't believe that there is any think tank that has particular influence over well, but yeah, again, Joint Resolution Foundation, Torsten Bell is probably going to become an MP. IPPR is another. New Economics Foundation is another. All of them will have sought to advise Rachel Reeves, but it's not at all clear that she is particularly dependent upon any of them. Coming to your question, the political advisors around ministers, the SPACs, provide political advice, often, I think, very bad political advice, but that's what they do, rather than policy advice. The thick of it is not necessarily that far from actual, from actual reality. And in the past, because the political advisors have not been policy specialists, although one or two developments of that, but have not come in as policy specialists, but as come in through their political contacts. I think it's been easier for I think the intellectual challenge that is needed to officials who, particularly in the Treasury, who cast a skeptical eye on the ideas of the Chancellor or the Prime Minister or the ministers of other major departments, hasn't been there. I think it should be there. But typically, those are not the kind of people who are taken on by ministers of special advisors. Now, whether that will be different under Starmer, I just don't know. I hope so.
Thank you, Ivor. We have some more questions here. What are the panelists' views on the feasibility and value of greater taxation of wealth? I guess land's an example of that. Does Ed, Robin, Ben, any of you want to comment on that? Wealth taxes?
I think when we think about wealth taxes, we need to think about how distortionary they are and how much revenue we can actually raise from them. And the gap in the public finances is quite significant. And this is kind of one of the reasons why we say income taxes are probably going to be needed, because the scale of that kind of challenge probably can't be done just by piecemeal tax changes and kind of hopes to get like uncertain amount from wealth taxes. So that's why we kind of think about income taxes in that way. I can't comment too much on specifics of wealth taxes, but I think that's something we need to be aware of is will it provide with certainty enough to cover the scale of the problem, and what will be the impacts on kind of capital expenditure as a result of that?
I think that's exactly the right point. Just to add to that, the obvious thing: you start taxing wealth, then you discourage saving. So it's a way of raising revenue very quickly, but probably makes things worse in the long term. And the point is, we have a long-term problem here, and this is why income taxes, I think, are the obvious thing to go for. Essentially, it's exactly what Ed just said. We're getting to the end, so okay, we have an answer actually to previous questions. So I'll read this out. Google tells us that Katie Martin is Rachel Reeves's chief of staff. I have no idea who Katie Martin is. So Edward Troop formerly HMRC, is her advisor, and Neil Amin Smith is her special advisor. This is Peter Dalton. He says it's not clear what economics background any of these individuals have, so we'll see. I'm going to move on to what I think will be the last question, because I really like this one. If you had to choose 3 policies for new Labour government to implement, what would those be and why? I'm going to change that slightly. I'm going to go round everybody.
So I think it would be the first pillar of the fiscal framework reform. So that is to remove public investment from the targets, essentially. And that is something that Rachel Reeves alluded to in her May's lecture. I would like to see her sort of keep her word on that. So that would be my one policy that I'd like to see.
For me, it would be widen the sectoral inclusion in the carbon tax mechanism.
For me, unsurprisingly, it's probably going to be raise income taxes, or at least don't pledge them out, so accept that they may need to raise in the future.
For me, it would be addressing skills mismatch. That's exactly the kind of research I do, so I think that's very important.
I think to carry on the previous policies that have been 30 hours for each chapter, the infrastructure is not currently in place. They need to get these people, these childcare centres that are open at the right time when people work. And I think that's a priority. If they want to help working parents, they need to actually have the infrastructure, so it's pointless if they don't.
I think I'd just re-emphasise what I said in my remarks about reform of the tax system, and I worry that that uniform pledges to not increase certain taxes really reduce room for manoeuvre in that respect. But with you can look at income tax and the various cliff edges in that system. You can look at council tax, where we're basing property values on a metric from 43 years ago, 33 years ago, isn't it? A long time ago, when there is scope to actually make the tax system work better and to be more efficient. And that's a point where you need an efficiently productive economy, where scope for raising additional revenue is going to be very limited. I think that's absolutely vital.
Thank you. Ivan.
Are we very greedy and have 4?
No, no, 1. Just 1.
I would, by an act of parliament, as the Victorians did, build infrastructure in this country, which would bypass the normal planning and frankly environmental objections that are made to so much of this infrastructure. This is both in terms of house building and housing.
Well, thank you for those wonderful policies. It's 12:30, so I'm going to close with my one thing, which is not so much a policy, but I genuinely hope that both Jeremy Hunt and Rachel Reeves and the finance ministers, or potential finance ministers of all the other parties, I just don't know the names, I'm afraid. I hope that they all pick up these briefings, which have been written by my colleagues, which are all excellent and are well worth the read, and that they take on board what NISA has to say, and that we see some better policies coming through, whichever party